Welcome to the second in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey, psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. My name is Rob Meager. I'm an interfaith minister, and I lead a spiritual ministry initiative in Ottawa, Canada called Spiritual Guidance. And I've been a student of Richard Harvey's work since 2012. Today's interview will discuss the lecture Absolute Freedom, Part 1, from the Sashti Poorthi Lecture Seminars. It's an 8-part lecture series, and each subsequent interview in this interview series will explore in more detail each one of the lectures in the Sashti Poorthi Lecture Seminars. Today's interview about the lecture Absolute Freedom and all of the manuscripts are contained in an ebook entitled Dharma Sky, which is available through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. Dharma Sky is one of a trilogy of 3 ebooks, each containing 14 lectures, totaling 42 lectures. The second ebook is entitled Moksha Dawn, and the third ebook is entitled Bodhi Ocean, and is currently in production. Again, all ebooks are available through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. You can also listen to the full recording of each of the lectures in this series online through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. And now I'd like to provide you with some background about Richard Harvey. He's a psychospiritual psychotherapist, author, and spiritual teacher. His career spans 37 years, working with individuals, couples, groups, and communities. He trained in humanistic and transpersonal psychologies and psychotherapy, studied meditation in India, and trained in Zodo Zen. He has been influenced by Jung, Gurdjieff, Alan Watts, and Joseph Campbell, and ancient Taoist and the Vedas, predominantly Advaita Vedanta. He has a particular affinity with Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Ramana Maharshi, and was more recently inspired by Adidas Samraj and Nisargadatta. Deeper than all these varied experiences and teachings, however, is the early sense of truth Richard possessed since childhood, a deep understanding and intimacy with the noumena, the divine source of being. It is from this innate wisdom that his spiritual teaching has blossomed, grown, and developed. Richard is a prolific and passionate writer. 2 of his books are self-published efforts, The Book of Being in 1998 and Tao's Gift in 2005. The Flight of Consciousness was published by Ashgrove Publishing in 2002. His latest book, Your Essential Self, The Inner Journey to Authenticity and Spiritual Enlightenment, was published by Llewellyn Worldwide Limited in 2013. And Richard has published nearly 200 articles, and he's currently working on his forthcoming book entitled Your Sacred Calling. Richard's lifetime of study, work, and experience has culminated in his independent psychospiritual psychotherapy practice from his mountaintop spiritual center, Cortillo Llano Tramontano. The center is set in a beautiful and tranquil 3 acres on the southern slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains in Andalusia, Spain. And from his center, Richard offers individual therapy and couples counseling in person or via Skype to people all over the world, psychospiritual training and supervision, as well as courses and retreats. Richard's work connects personality and spirituality through a middle stage of heart awakening, authenticity, and compassion in his comprehensive model of human awakening and human development, the 3 stages of awakening. He is the founder of sacred attention therapy, a profound, radical, and fresh approach to sacred spiritual life and to the dilemmas which have arisen from the accelerated development of ego processes in the 21st century. He believes that it is through the transformation of the individual in his unique struggle to become fully him or herself that we will progress through a collective gestation of soul and spirit into a timely light and expanded consciousness. And now it's my pleasure to invite and welcome Richard Harvey to the call. Hello.
Hi, Rob.
Good to see you.
You too.
I'm most looking forward to diving in to each of these lectures. The first interview we had a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the total, the whole of the Sashti Poorthi lecture seminars. And now we have this opportunity to look at each one. And this first lecture we're talking about is Absolute Freedom, the Path of Love, Devotion, and Surrender, in part 1 of 2, because it's a 2-part seminar. And you begin the lecture by saying, and I quote, "At the very heart of my work is a spiritual way that addresses the predicament of the modern era." And my question is, and it's a very important one, and I'll explain why, what is the predicament of the modern era? You talk about your work being founded in addressing the predicament of the modern era, and I think it's critically important to have this discussion because it's central to this lecture, Absolute Freedom. But as you say here, it's at the heart of your work. And could we talk a little bit, or spend a little bit of time talking about what is that predicament of the modern era?
The peculiar predicament of the modern era, firstly, shares in common with the 20th century. It is, in short, the self-contraction. The self-contraction is the ego, or the mind. It is the processes that lead us into the delusion that we are separate from each other, from life, from the world we live in. Now that in and of itself isn't so peculiarly different from, let's say, 100 years ago, except for it has become increasingly sophisticated. For example, 120 years ago or so, we had the dawning of Western psychology via an interpretation of dreams published by Freud and Brewer, and this has led into a remarkable body of work which we consider Western psychology. But when you look at it, much of it is based on tradition. And the predicament of humanity 100 years ago was qualitatively different to how it is today. It's much more complex. And the reasons are many and varied. They could really be summarized as the 20th century. The 20th century has been, I believe, a massive shock for humanity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
War, technology, weapons of mass destruction, a nuclear capability, commercial, corporate world, ecology, the changes in the ozone, global warming. Mm-hmm. The list is massive. When you look at the 18th, 17th centuries, it's comparatively simple. And even the 19th century, where there was enormous revolutions in communications and transport and other areas of human life, which itself constituted a revolution of kinds, even a technological revolution. The 20th century has built on that to the degree that it's very hard, as we enter the 21st century, to see a comparable paradigm, because there isn't one. Now, human psychology has been slow to catch up with this. Psychotherapy certainly has been slow to catch up with this. Many psychotherapists, certainly within the establishment in the Western world, are working with people based on models from psychoanalysis or behavioral psychology. These are old. There's at least 50 years old. The world is very different even 50 years ago. It's very different 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So my sense is that something crucial is happening. And over and above that, and most importantly, I believe, is the fact that the sacred spiritual consciousness of humanity is deteriorating. And it is deteriorating in the sense, not in the obvious sense, because people speak more about spirituality today than ever, but in the most effective sense in which it can be eroded, which is people speaking about the sacred and the spiritual are usually confounded between the soul and the spirit. And spirituality itself is a different matter to our relationship to the world, to our relationships to each other, and to our human happiness, our interpersonal happiness, our satisfaction and the fulfillment of our desires. If we don't recognize that the sacred spiritual truths are disappearing, then a foundational level whereby human beings can know themselves will disappear. Now, I've said a lot. Over to you.
I was going to share that it's interesting you brought up just a minute ago this distinction between the soul and the spirit, and later on in some lectures we'll actually get into that, because your sharing your teachings of the difference between soul and spirit is, I think, very important. I want to echo your comments a few minutes ago about even the significant change in humanity in the past 30 years, let alone the past 100. I often think how in my lifetime, being in my late 40s now, but when I was growing up as a child, during those formative years between the ages, say, 10 and 20, and what you may talk about in your philosophy is those second and third 7-year stages of life. I look back and I think I had it pretty easy as a child growing up. I would not want to be a child growing up in the world today. What a child would have to deal with today, they're dealing with far more than even 30 years ago. So just echoing your comments that humanity has changed so much in the past few decades alone. It's really quite interesting to observe. Later on in the manuscript and in the lecture, and this again focused on what is this predicament, you state, the modern human dilemma I referred to earlier, which we just talked about, is this. In our self-contraction, which is another term for our ego or false self, we are doomed inevitably to suffer from self-inflicted restlessness. And I rest humbly in that comment, and I find myself wanting to laugh, giggle at myself, because I recognize it in myself. And see it, and there is the gift in many others, if not everyone else who walks in this time and space. How is it possible to transcend that suffering of self-inflicted restlessness?
By moving closer to your center, you see. The ego really, the image that mind has provided us with really is a shell. It really is a shell without a center. If you believe in the ego or the self-contraction or mind, which is a given, I mean, it's a given cultural, modern day event that everybody believes in themselves as separate from everything else. And just think of for a minute, I mean, you know it anyway, we all know it anyway, but just consider for a minute what you're setting yourself up for. Not when you construct an ego and then live through it, but when you believe yourself to be it, which is an important distinction. Not when you construct it as a vehicle, but when you construct it, then you believe yourself to be it. It's like me thinking I'm this shirt, or this hair, or the car I got outside, these kinds of things. You are not the ego. The ego is a vehicle. You constructed your ego during the beginnings of your life in response to given stimuli, and out of this you arranged patterns of emotion and behavior into a viable ego vehicle. That's all it is. And so far so good. I mean, be in it, use it, drive around in it, present it, use it appropriately. But am I the ego? Of course not. The ego is merely a periphery. It's a persona. So when you realize this, the question is, how do you come from the periphery in further to the very center, when this periphery is always in motion because it's always in conflict, it's always in angst, it's always trying, struggling because it's within the midst of an enormous conflict. You've made everything else other. And in my book, The Flight of Consciousness, I use the analogy of the spinning top. The spinning top, which, those of us old enough to have one of these as a toy, is something you spin it, and it has this, it's not going to work without an aligned center, and then it's usually colorful, or maybe it's wooden with patterns on, but the thing goes round, and it goes round and round, and everything's in movement. But everything's in movement because within is this perfectly aligned center, which arguably doesn't have a space in and of itself. It is a perfect center around which it's all revolving. This center is where you're trying to get to. If you want to transcend the ego, and if you want to enter into the process that you're asking me about, which is to transcend the restlessness. The ego and the related conditions of persona or image on the periphery, the circumference of myself, will always be in a struggle. Always. It's not there that freedom lies. It's right here in the middle. It's
interesting you use the analogy of a spinning top, and I think a very good one. And you draw the lesson or the teaching of the centeredness, in the middle. But it also brings to me the idea and the teaching of balance, because when you think about a spinning top, everything's in perfect balance, and it starts with that core. It starts with that center around which everything else revolves, but in balance. And when the centering is not there, and the balance starts to get thrown off, then the top will topple over. You were talking earlier about the ego, and I've heard it somewhere, and it may have actually been from you, Richard, but the whole purpose of the ego is to have an experience. And it has the experience, or our experiences, through our senses, through our eyes, through our taste, through our hearing, and the other senses, and that's its whole purpose. If we choose to get caught up in it, though, in the whirlwind, that's when we can get thrown out of our center, and we stay centered in simply observing the experience and not getting caught up in it.
you touch on something very important, which is that the reason that the center is not strugglesome, restlessness, conflict, and so on, is that it is experience-less. And what's happening today, just to touch on this very important point, which is sitting in here, like the elephant in the room, is the spirituality that people inevitably come to us with, I suggest, is populist, and it is concerned with improving the experience. Now, improving the experience is very much like polishing the car when the engine is too old to repair. There's just no point. And improving our experience, of course, is understandable, and for certain of us it's absolutely appropriate, it's apt. It doesn't work for me, and it doesn't work for anyone who's genuinely interested in spirituality. Because we know that true spirituality is of the infinite, it's not of the present relative time-space continuum where you clean cars or improve experience or make more money. You may do any of these things, but it's not in and of itself spiritual. What's in and of itself is something quite beyond, and therefore it is experience-less.
I want to pick up, I'm just going to flow with what you shared, because there's something you've touched on that is critical to, at least in my experience, your teachings. And you talked about populist views of spirituality. And your lectures, to say often may be a little dramatic, but they sometimes challenge perhaps many of the modern populist views on spirituality. In fact, some might dismiss some of your work as blasphemy or as heresy, because it does challenge some of the populist views. And in some of your later lectures, you refer more directly to some of those examples of the populist views and the populist takes on the populist teachers, and that for another lecture. But the question is, because it's one that I've always been drawn to with your work, because it seems to be the direction that I'm taking with my work. And why did you decide not to water down your teachings to make them more commercial? Many people who will remain nameless, and again, in later lectures, there are specifics shared in terms of some examples. But you have walked the road of speaking your truth and choosing not to purposefully try and make it more accessible from a commercial point of view for the sakes of making it more commercial. You've stayed true to your truth, to your beliefs about the psycho-spiritual therapeutic approach. And why have you done that? Why have you stayed true to that and not attempted to make it more commercial and in the process watering it down?
I'm just not really interested. Just to pick up on a minor point, these are not my beliefs. It's very important to me that this comes over. I'm not remotely interested in Richard's beliefs or opinions or views as a result of his life experience or his point of view. That no more in genuine spirituality is there an experience than there is a point of view. There isn't one. It's beyond point of view for the simple reason that it's all-inclusive. There's no separation, there's no differentiation. That is the core spiritual insight. And if I were to find a reason for not watering it down, it's because hardly anybody is saying that today. I don't wish ill of any of the spiritual teachers, and I've been criticized about this, and people have said to me, look, I can see you've got something, and I can see you great, and you've got the real thing, and blah, 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 but such and such a person led me to you, and such a person was my introduction, and so on. And for a while, I rode with that, and I thought, this is nice, I get it. There's spiritual teachers, and there's spiritual teachers. It's just like anything else. It kind of works. That's not a problem. The problem is when the so-called spiritual teachers speak about spirituality in ways which are patently not true. It doesn't reflect the truth. It's not what is real. And they, in my view, and I'm sure unconsciously, without any malevolence, I'm sure, are more than anything going to be responsible, if we take the dark view, for the atrophying and the final erosion of sacred spiritual reality traditions, which hardly anybody knows about already. But if you have teachers who are diluting and watering down and actually saying things which are patently not true, because it's very hard to speak to people about spirituality when after they're much more interested in, polishing a car, much more interested in happiness, inverted commas, or improving their relationship, or making more money, or having a more creative life, and all this kind of thing. Absolutely understandable. I mean, we don't have any trouble with that. How can any of us have any trouble with that? You're born into the body, you struggle some for a few years, you construct a viable ego, and then you confuse yourself with it. Now, if that's as far as your awareness goes, it looks like life is all about having children, raising a family, having a car, polishing it, making money, getting a mortgage, having a nice job, and whatever, and good for you. People are different. People are all different. This has never been my way, and I always had a innate conviction of the Spirit, an innate conviction of God that was beyond verbal. And it was in my early 20s, I fell out of the music that I was involved in, which music was the closest I had ever got to a expression of spirituality, and I think rightfully so. I can, it makes sense. Into a group of people at that time who, meditating and doing therapy and consciousness raising and, raising their awareness and all this kind of thing. And I thought, I'm home. This is something like it. This is something I haven't been able to talk about before, and it's happening here amongst a group of people. And so I've always been finding or trying to find a milieu or a way to say something that I have within me. It's an inner knowledge. It's a deep understanding of self. It's a deep understanding of God, so far as you can say that. And so if I were to be offered, which in a way when you start publishing, around the world, in a way you are offered the chance to make it more popular and to offer it in a way that will be more saleable and so on, it's very difficult for me. I made certain compromises with the last 2 books, and I'm convinced that I probably have to do it again, but I would love to be in a position where I didn't have to. The only way you can do that is, of course, by being powerful enough in the commercial world and say, well, I don't want that cover, and I don't want to write the chapters that way. In the meantime, the truth against any compromise in my published work around the world is very minimal. I've only let go of a few words. It's a % or something. Mm-hmm. The rest of it is straightforward. And this is the only thing that I'm interested. I wouldn't do this if I were to water it down. One last thing I think about this is it seems to be a role. I mean, I would like to be with other people, and in a sense perhaps I'm beginning to be with other people who recognize the atrophying of the spiritual traditions of truth. And more of us could band together, and I'm sure I'm not the only one by any means. And this is a role which increasingly seems to be there for me, a purpose, if you will, in later life.
I want to come back to this discussion of the predicament of the modern era. And again, near the very beginning of the lecture, you referenced the term Kali Yuga, or Kali Yuga. And you state this predicament, as I see it, is rather similar to the idea of the Kali Yuga. And you go on to explain that the term is from Hindu cosmology that denotes the darkening of the light, the time of least spirituality, morality, and transcendence. And this is a thread of discussion that we could use a whole interview about, because it's one that's of particular interest to me. This idea of the dark times, the Kali Yuga. And I wanted to ask you, what makes you feel or sense this, that we are in this time of the darkened state?
I would submit simply that it's self-evident. I think if you just take a step back and you look carefully at the last 100 years where we started talking the first question, and you consider the events of the 20th century, everything that's happening in the modern world. And I think if you then look around for some kind of, predictive teaching or some kind of context for it, as very often is the case, it comes from the ancient teachings of the Indus Valley, where there's many paradigms and archetypal teachings which we don't really, it seems to me, anywhere else have anything of their equal. And one is the Kali Yuga, and the reason I'm a little tentative about the Kali Yuga, of course, is it's something like 320-something thousand years these different ages are meant to last, and of course they don't make any historical sense at all. And so therefore we take a lot of it symbolically. We try and, science won't agree with the Indus Valley view of the physical universe or anything. On the other hand, we know from Fritjof Kopper and people like this that there's a lot of truth, apparently, even for physicists, in the teachings of the Vedanta, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita even. And I think when you look at human history and you consider these times, and you consider, after all, that the dark times of ignorance will not be about devil worshipping, and everybody will be wearing Gothic clothes or something and chopping people's heads off, and some sort of Hollywood depiction of the dark time. The dark time will be the time of ignorance, where the precious gems of the inner realms and the spiritual, soulful domains will be forgotten. And they'll be being systematically forgotten. You can't really point your finger at somebody like a Saddam Hussein or a Hitler and say, he's the bad guy, we'll go get him or something. This is something within collective human psyche.
You said something
and we're all
very
part
interesting in initially responding to that question. And the question again was, what makes you feel or sense that we're at this time in the Kali Yuga? And in initially responding, you said, it's self-evident. And Richard, this topic is a real passion for me. In part because many spiritual traditions talk about how we have the ability, or the choice, you could say, to see whatever it is we want. We can train our mind. Some would say fool our mind, but I'm going to say train our mind to see whatever it is we want. If that's the case, then how we see this time can, I think, very much shape how we see ourselves and our place in this world. Let me explain a little more, if I can. I think I understand what you're sharing when you talk about this dark time. I mean, many other people talk about this dark time. And you can label it whatever you want. Kali Yuga, you can call it Armageddon, you can whatever you want. And I can certainly understand where it may raise anxiousness, even fear, concern for people. Because you don't have to look too far to see example after example after example. For the most part, those aren't the emotions I feel associated with this dark time. I feel predominantly excitement. Excitement because the current major systems, the environment, healthcare, government, economy, finance, you name the other major systems that seemingly hold the whole of everyday life together. They had broken. They're not in the process of crumbling, they are broken. And it is through the death of something that something new transforms and comes out of it. And I'm very inspired and excited at this time because we're in this transformational process. Now, how long will this process be? Who knows? But I find myself more excited than anything at this time, even though I'm very aware that there seem to be these forces of decay, of demolition, of destruction. From that is born something new, and I'm just really excited about what that something new is going to be.
And you're right to be excited, but you see, you're a spiritual person. I'm excited. I'm excited and I'm disillusioned by turns. I mean, I have the two focuses, and I know in a sense that you do, but what I would suggest is that excitement comes from an awareness that while we're here in this state at this time, we're born into this world via the body and then the ego formation, we actually participate in many, many, many different realms. As, for example, Tibetan Buddhism has given us a map of that very clearly to some degree. It's shown the different realms and the wheel of life and so on, and this sort of idea. But there's many, many, many different realms, and in one day, in 1 hour, in fact, you and I and anybody else may occupy various worlds, and we may forget that we've done it. We may forget that we've been there. It doesn't change the essential critical focus of this place, and neither are the other places unimportant. But we tend to our garden, so to speak. We tend to the place where our soul is born. And this is the garden, or the place where my soul and your soul and the soul of everyone who's listening to this talk and so on reside in space and time. But you and I and all those people are not essentially of this soul world. We're not essentially of that. In other words, when this world dies, or when we die to this world, both either, we are not annihilated. We are not finished. We occupy many worlds. As I've said many times, there's one fear, and it's the fear of death. And if you transcend the fear of death, then you transcend fear itself. And what does that take? It takes knowing that I am not this. Then what am I? And if you know that you're not this, and you've taken any step towards, well, then what am I? Of course you'll be excited at the destruction of the present world situation, which can only lead to a brighter new world, a brighter new creation. However, I would just add as an addendum to that there is a light to hold. There is a light that we need to hold through this darkness. There is a flickering fire, perhaps ashes even, that we need to preserve in some way. The glow of in the face of this darkness. It sounds dramatic,
Mm-hmm.
but it's actually what it looks like. It
Mm-hmm.
really is that overwhelming and insidious and not obvious, not tangible in a sense. We need to be incredibly integrous, and we need to be inner, and we need to promote those inner things, and we need to distinguish the inner tools and processes and truths from the ones that resemble but actually are not the very precious gem of inner truth. So excited is good, but I think you're excited in the same way as I'm excited, and if I wasn't of a spiritual nature, and neither you, we may be a little more superficially excited, or maybe not all that excited, because a lot of people are not really very excited anymore. A lot of people are not terribly happy anymore, and we know that mental illness is enormously prevalent now for perhaps the first time in human history. There's one of the self-evident features of the Kali Yuga.
To see through the darkness into the light. And I'll leave this interview with that wish and that intention for everyone to surrender and trust and have faith that the light is there. We just simply have to look for it. And it looks.
Perhaps I could just add very briefly the point of capacity and potential, which is inner work, looking in whatever way you choose to, leads to an understanding of one's role in this. What it is you have the capacity and the potential, this is where you find your purpose, or the expression of your being that has some real meaning. And at this time, in this modern era and this difficult time, it's very important. The more people gain that clarity,
when people continue
to understand
watching
what their capacity
these interviews, hopefully we can help them reach that clarity. It feels, Richard, like we just began, but our time is up for today. So the next time we come together in a fortnight, we will discuss part 2 of the Absolute Freedom, correct? Until then, thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.